and welcome to our latest lunchtime seminar here at TBI, and welcome to all those of you joining on the live stream. We're talking today about anarchy in the UK and everywhere else, and delighted to welcome our speaker, Mirko Draca, who is Director at the Centre for Comparative Advantage in the Global Economy, CAGE, based at Warwick University. And Mirko is an applied economist, and over the years he's taken empirical techniques to a hugely diverse range of topics, from looking at the impact of prices on crime and looking at the impact of minimum wage and all sorts of other things. And today he's going to talk about his work taking some of those techniques to questions about what's happening in the electorate and what are the deep roots of populism and what can we do about them. And it comes to some pretty depressing conclusions for anybody who's already seen this stuff covered. In particular, I was quite taken by the quote from you, Mirko, when you launched this version of this paper. You said centrist politics has to fight for its influence in a completely new and uncomfortable way. So that sounds a bit worrying, and hopefully we'll get into that a bit. But we'll, so welcome, Mirko. We'll give you about half an hour to tell us your story, and then hopefully open it up to questions.
Great. All right. Okay, so thank you very much, Ian. And thanks for inviting me. So this is work with Carlo Schwarz, who's a PhD student at Warwick, who's doing his own really interesting work on the effects of social media on politics and on crime. So you should look out for his kind of independent research as well. Okay, so I think we can say that, since particularly the events of 2016, there's been a return to what you could think of as the proverbial interesting times in politics, right? I tend to see what's occurred in politics over the last 5 years or so in terms of two main trends, right? So firstly, there's this apparent rise in ideological polarization and conflict across a range of issues, right? So, climate change is the perennial one, but you've got conflict over social issues and, the role of government, okay, and the role of government in markets. So that's one trend, right? The second trend is what I tend to think of as the rise of insurgent political forces in politics. And you can see this as either the rise of outsider political parties, such as the AfD in Germany, Five Star in Italy, or an early example was Syriza in Greece. And then another kind of channel of this sort of political insurgence is what you would think of as insurgent candidates in mainstream, what we thought of as mainstream political parties. And the obvious examples there are people like Trump, Jeremy Corbyn, and Bernie Sanders. And then, given these two trends, which I think are a fairly kind of straightforward characterization of the big structural changes, the obvious hypothesis is that in some way that these insurgent success is linked to or underpinned by this ideological polarization. That is that they're kind of tapping into some kind of underlying changes in the pattern of beliefs in the population, right? So, and what this paper is talking about is the evidence on this kind of hypothesis about underlying changes in polarizations and the nature of political beliefs. So in terms of what evidence there is, it's firstly useful to think about the concept of elite polarization, right? So this is describing kind of what's happening in terms of the behavior of our political elites, that is our politicians and the people who work for them. In terms of day-to-day behaviours and, for example, voting behaviours in parliaments and other kind of legislative bodies. The most potent example of kind of elite polarisation that I've seen recently is this work by Matt Genskow, Jesse Shapiro, and Matt Taddy, right? So what they do in this paper is, it's a kind of nice, simple, clear approach. Is they're looking at patterns of what they think of as speech polarization in the US Congress, right? And so the simple way to think about this is that they're running this regression where on the left-hand side they've got the party affiliation of a given speaker in the Congress, a congressman. And then on the right-hand side of this regression, they've got this massive set of variables, this vector of variables on the words that these politicians are using in their speech, right? And the idea is that they're trying to predict the party affiliation of the congressman based on the words that they're using, right? And so what they're finding here is they're looking at the data from the 1870s up until the late 2000s, right? The two lines towards the bottom represent what was going on in the 1870s and then what was going on in the late 1980s, right? And that's telling you that, you know, Republican and Democrat, you've basically got, you know, at random a 50-50 chance of correctly predicting the party affiliation of the speaker, right? So that's saying that there's pretty limited predictive power. So this vertical line represents 1 minute's worth of speech. So it's telling you that there's pretty limited predictive power in the language that politicians are using in the Congress right up until the late 1980s, right? And then this massively shoots up like by the time we get to the late 2000s, right? And so what Genskow, Shapiro, and Taddy sort of suggest here is they don't have any kind of, in this research, like they essentially establish this. It's a very simple regression, but requires lots of really good, careful, smart econometrics. They sort of moot that or suggest that there have been changes in the political environment. So in particular, changes in the nature of strategic political communication, right, and changes in the nature of the media environment, in particular the rise of cable TV in the US, that may have contributed to this sort of increase in elite, this measure of elite polarization, right? And similar to this, we can have a look at other types of measures of, for example, patterns of congressional roll call voting, which are also showing kind of the emergence of very polarized positions in voting between Republicans and Democrats from about the mid-1980s onwards, right? So it seems that kind of elite polarization is a thing, right? So we can see that across a range of evidence in the US, and it's starting to emerge in other countries when we look at these patterns of how our politicians behave or the people who work for them, that they are separating across a whole set of different behaviors and different outcomes. Then there's the matter of citizen polarization, right? So here the evidence is not so decisive. So political scientists such as Fiorina in the US argue that we're not necessarily seeing a phenomenon of underlying sort of ideological polarization amongst the general public, but rather that people are becoming more sorted, right? So essentially saying that the underlying pattern of beliefs is just the same, but people are sort of splitting the difference. They're not identifying as, for example, independents anymore. They're identifying as either Republicans or Democrats or whatever affiliation suits the context. This seems to be sort of, it's hard to find kind of strong evidence of kind of a separation of beliefs amongst the general public, right? And so this is evident also in the data that we consider here in our main paper. So this is evidence from the World Value Survey in the underlying data in our paper, which is looking at a question related to people's own self-positioning on the left-right scale, right? So, people, the lower numbers for the left, the higher numbers are for people who self-identify as being more right-wing, right? And so what this is telling you is that you've got essentially this sort of the masses across two different periods, the 1990s and the 2010s, and we're seeing kind of very limited changes in the mass, right? So most people are in the middle, so 30% sort of identify around 5 or 6, and what you're seeing is actually, there's this slight drift to the left, but there's no kind of major separation of beliefs, right? So we're not necessarily seeing classic polarization in the sense of the tails of the distribution build up in terms of mass, right? And so this kind of pattern is evident across lots of different data sets, right? That we're not necessarily, if we're taking these traditional left-right measures, we're not necessarily seeing big changes in what's going on in terms of underlying beliefs. So that kind of, when you look at that evidence of elite polarization versus citizen polarization, that kind of suggests a potential track to explore. That is that kind of polarization and division could be a disease of the elites, right? That this is, because politicians are sitting there in the Congress or the Parliament in this environment where they're soaked in the media, soaked in cable TV. These people are, always on social media, right? It could be there's just something going on in terms of the incentives of the environment facing our political elites, and it's separated from what's actually happening amongst the general public, right? And kind of added to what you see there is there's a kind of more general sort of puzzle about the pattern of beliefs amongst the general public in terms of kind of classic questions such as redistribution, right? Where we expect kind of lower income people to have a higher preference for redistributive policies, but over many different data sets, they don't exhibit that pattern, right? And that's kind of where we're going with this paper, right? So it could be that you've got this hypothesis of polarization is a disease of the elites, or it could be that there's just something that we haven't understood about the underlying pattern of people's beliefs across a lot of different political issues. And so that's what we do, right? So our approach here is we're going to use these sort of unsupervised machine learning tools to study this underlying pattern of beliefs amongst the general public across a large range of questions, right? So essentially what you need to know here is that we've got a bunch of survey questions across different issues, and we're looking for coherent clusters of opinions in that data, right? So we're essentially running these sort of pattern recognition algorithms to just find a pattern such that people clump their answers together in some systematic way, right? And those clusters are what we're going to think about as some sort of underlying systematic latent political ideologies. In particular, think of them as citizen ideologies, right? So the questions that we're going to talk about here are going to cover a full range of different issues. So what we've done here is we went into the World Value Survey, a kind of international survey of all kinds of kind of political views and personal values and behaviours, and we picked out the set of kind of questions that are consistently asked and defined over time, right? In order so we can sort of track, we're tracking like for like in terms of underlying questions. So what we're going to have here is about 29 questions. You've got a bunch of questions about broadly social issues. So who would you like or not like to have as neighbours? So people of a different race, immigrants, people of a different sexuality, and so on. Questions about competition and government ownership, and kind of questions about welfare. A group of questions that will prove important about confidence in different institutions such as the press, the parliament, civil services, armed forces, and so on. And then a bunch of questions about what I would think of as social issues or social ethics issues, right? So questions about prostitution, homosexuality, abortion, divorce, and then questions about things like cheating on taxes and avoiding a fare on public transport, right? So these questions, I stress, they're selected on the basis that this is just the stuff we observe consistently over time, so that we can sort of think about changes on a like-for-like basis, right? But the idea of this is to have a set of questions that we think is kind of a reasonably representative set in terms of what we would think of as trying to think of a set over which we could define citizen ideologies. Okay, so that's the set of questions, right? What we do with that is we run these unsupervised machine learning clustering algorithms. So I call this unsupervised machine learning clustering algorithms, latent Dirichlet allocation topic models in 2 short slides, right? Okay, the essay crisis version, right? Okay, so these particular algorithms that we're using were first developed for the analysis of text data, right, by David Bly in the main at Columbia University, right? And so they're known essentially as these topic models, right? And the example here would be like modeling the underlying structure of a text document, right? In this case, it's a journal article in sort of evolutionary genetics. So the nature of this article is seeking lifespan necessities. It's about sort of figuring out what is the minimum set of genetic information that you require in order to kind of have life, right? So it's just the minimum core set of genes that you need to kind of create what we would think of as life, right? And so the idea of this algorithm is it proposes what you would think of as this probabilistic structure behind the creation of the document, right? And it proceeds in a few steps. So firstly, there's the step of deciding on the topic shares, right? Of the different sort of latent topics from which you're going to draw in order to kind of write this article, write this paper, right? So in this case, given this article is about kind of minimum genetic information, the topics that you're going to think about are, for example, a genetics topic, with words like gene, DNA, and genetic, evolutionary biology topic with words like life, evolve, and organism, a neuroscience topic, and then also in terms of methodology, some sort of computational topic, with words like data, number, and computer, right? So you're kind of imagining a scientist there sitting, I'm going to write this paper, I'm interested in this. It's sort of, he makes either a conscious or subconscious decision to kind of choose some set of topic shares across these kind of different bins of kind of more pure ideas, right? So you have that first topic share step, and then you have the topic assignment step, right? So as someone goes through a document, right, you know, they're assigning one of the topics to that section of the document, right? So early in the introduction, you're probably going to, you know, because it's mainly about genetic stuff, you're going to draw from the genetics topic, right? Later on, as you're talking about the methodology of how you did all of your scientific work, you're probably going to draw from the computational topic, right? So it's giving us, so we think of this as a mixed membership structure, right? And what we do in our paper is, you know, this isn't something that's exclusive to text data. It's just you can, you know, run this algorithm on any kind of data, which you can represent as kind of what we think of as discrete tokens, right? So the way that we're going to think about this is that, you know, instead of these kind of word distributions, we're going to have these ideologies as the latent topics, right? And people are going to sort of come up with their own mixture of underlying ideological topics in order to describe their personal ideology, right? So in that sense, people could draw from a left-wing topic for their kind of the social issues part of their beliefs, and let's say a more right-wing topic for their economic beliefs, right? So that's what the main advantage of this is, this idea of a mixed membership structure, where I don't have to put you in exclusively in a bin, which is left-wing, right-wing, or centre. I can, you know, allocate you as a mixture of these different ideologies. Okay, so that's what we do is, you know, we apply this basic approach of topic modelling, this mixed membership structure, to the survey data that I showed you before. And then what we do in terms of the implementation of this algorithm is we tell the clustering algorithm just to look for different numbers of topics, right? So firstly 2 topics, then 3 topics, 4 topics, and so on. And then, you know, instead of reporting the top words that you're most likely to choose per topic, we're going to report the top 10 issue positions in terms of your survey responses, all right? Okay, so this is what we get when we run the 2-topic model, right? So here, essentially, the data is separating into 2 different types, you know, which you can label as left and right. So part of this is you have to self-label the material. So here, it's kind of seems to separate quite well that you've got a left-wing type, which is kind of liberal on social issues, and then a right-wing type, which is kind of more conservative on social issues, right? So far, so good. You know, the clustering algorithm is working well in that sense, in terms of it's delivering what we sort of expect. Then we run the 3-topic model, and that's where we got the first surprise, right? Because we weren't necessarily looking for what we found here. So we've got these kind of 2 types, which are roughly kind of a left type and a right type. And then the extra type that emerges as we allow the data to kind of give us a 3rd cluster is this type which has got sort of low confidence in all of these different institutions, such as the civil service, the parliament, churches, major companies, the press, and so on, right? And so the way, you know, that's kind of what the data is telling us, is that once you allow for a 3rd cluster emerge, that cluster seems to just jump on top of those questions that I showed you before about trust in institutions, right? So we're going to think about, you know, we call this an anarchist type. So we chose to kind of, you know, we've got the, you know, choice of our own labels, and we chose to kind of call this an anarchist type. Why anarchy? So firstly, kind of I would argue that, you know, the term populism is increasingly pejorative, right? So there's this quote, I certainly don't agree with Doug Murray on many issues, but, you know, this idea of populism, it's the BBC's new buzzword being used to sneer at the uneducated 17 million who voted for Brexit, right? So, and particularly, like, you know, Carlo and I see ourselves as kind of, you know, empirically oriented social scientists. You know, we want to stay away from that kind of pejorative label. So that's kind of one label. Another label would be anti-establishment. So I think, you know, these are 2 examples of recent books. So the book by Mick Hume is about the oppressive liberal establishment and how a liberalist, is there some, you know, a type of liberal establishment, whereas this book by Owen Jones is about, you know, an oppressive conservative establishment, right? So my point there is that, you know, arguably that kind of term is overused, right? So our argument is that this idea of anarchy is a better description of what's going on in terms of the roots of this empirical ideology as we found it in this deep distrust and opposition to current institutions, right? And then in terms of kind of this line up with what we're thinking about in terms of populism, If we go to the 4-type model, we see some further interesting developments, right? So as we allow the data to kind of give us 4 different clusters, what happens here is that effectively, the anarchist type splits into 2 different types, right? So we've got what we would think of as a left anarchist type, which has got low confidence in institutions and is progressive on social issues, and then the right anarchist type, which is going to have low confidence in institutions, but is going to be more right-wing on social issues and social ethics issues, right? So the way we see this as these are obviously, the data is telling us about these potential underpinnings of populist political movements in terms of these left anarchist and right anarchist types. Then finally, as we go to the 5-type model, right? So we're getting a type that this type, it's got low confidence in institutions, is socially progressive, and but likes the market economy, likes competition. So the way we think of this is as a sort of market liberal type, a libertarian type, right? Our nickname for this is a George Mason University blogger, if you sort of, in terms of that kind of combination of socially progressive ideas, but kind of a free market stance. And then, so as we kind of pull together all of these different types, right, going from the 2-type to the 5-type model, we can sort of track the correlations of their positions across the different orders of model. And what we think we get here is quite a plausible sort of ideological hierarchy and a sort of family of ideologies as we sort of kind of move down, right? And you can sort of extend the model to 6 and 7-type models of ideologies, and there it gets sort of less clear in terms of how you allocate people ideologically, how you would label things, right? So what you tend to see is a greater differentiation of the right-wing types, and then some differentiation of the left anarchists into what I would think of as a super anarchist type. But in terms of like the modeling, we think that the 4-type model of the 2 centrist types and the 2 anarchist types is the sort of best representation of what's going on in the data, in the sense that it explains the most out of sample. Okay, and then, so we've got this type, and then as I discussed, so this is sort of recent work that we've done, there's this clear correlation between these anarchist types, right, and patterns of populist voting. So within the World Value Survey, we've got information on voting patterns, so this is giving us what we call the bin scatter correlations, which is showing you this kind of very clear correlation between a greater individual share of an anarchist type within a person and the probability of populist voting. Another interesting finding that we've had here is that if you sort of run a regression of the probability of populist voting on the left-hand side, and then a measure of the left-right scale. So that left-right scale that I showed you earlier, we don't throw this into our survey questions, it's a different variable. So the first interesting finding here is that you get this U shape in the left-right scale. So that's telling you that if you're in the center, right, you're less likely to vote populist, right? So that's the first finding here. So there's this kind of U shape on the left-right scale. And then the second finding is the red lines are representing what that curve looks like once we control for the anarchist share, right? And what that's telling you is that, to some extent, yes, the anarchist types, they cluster to the ends of the left-right scale, but that doesn't explain everything that's going on in terms of the relationship between populist voting and the anarchist share, right? So one explanation might be that the anarchist anti-establishment types tend to be clustered at the ends of what we'd think of as the traditional left-right spectrum, but when we look at the data, it turns out that an anarchist share is evident across many different types of people based on their left-right positioning. Okay, so I've got about 8 minutes. All right, so that's the kind of big picture findings in terms of the different clusters of ideologies or latent ideologies we get in the data. And I've shown you sort of what those beliefs are composed of. The other element of the model is this empirical model is this mixed membership structure, right? So if you remember back to the structure of the article where they're writing they're drawing from the evolutionary biology topic, the genetics topic, and the computation topic, in terms of individual people, what we're going to get is people are going to, as I said, draw from different topics for their pattern of ideology, right? So let's say, in terms of my ideological shares, I would probably be 40% left anarchist, 40% liberal centrist, and then when someone doesn't indicate on the roundabout, like, then I'm 20% right anarchist. That's my authoritarian streak, right? And as I get older, it's sort of, I probably get more left anarchist as I get older, right? But, so that gives you that characterization, right? And I'll have different positions I'll draw from. Makes me reflect too much on my political beliefs, but I'll draw from one type for one area of my beliefs and another type for, on driving, I definitely draw from the right anarchist type, right? So, but we've got this data, like, for all of the individual observation, all the people, the individual observations in our data, and so what that allows us to do is plot these shares at the country level, right? And so that's just telling you that sort of what we're getting out of the data makes sense, right? So that in terms of this liberal centrist type, it's sort of what you'd expect, that the Northern European, Scandinavian countries have got the highest share in the kind of liberal centrist type, right? Similarly, if we look at the conservative centrist type, the places with the highest shares are essentially historically religious countries. So in this, we're using Western Europe and North America as our sort of the countries of interest, right? In terms of ideology in the UK, right? So here I think there's some interesting conclusions. So, right, I guess there's 3 points here is that, okay, centrism is not dead, right? So firstly, if you look at the liberal centrist group and the conservative centrist group, you're going to get sort of a majority of around 55% in terms of the ideological shares in the population. The second point would be that this right anarchist tendency eclipses the sort of the conservative centrist group on the right of British politics, right? So that's sort of giving you this indication. It's that kind of right anarchist grouping that dominates conservative politics, which is something that's obviously been emerging over the past couple of years. And then interestingly, the left anarchist ideological share is definitely in the minority in the UK relative to the liberal centrist share, right? So I think of this as how the left was won, right? So in terms of the data seems to indicate that there's not necessarily a strong natural base for like this kind of left anarchist politics, but over the past few years that's obviously been successful on the left in British politics, although that might be kind of changing. And I think this kind of gives you two sort of conclusions here. Firstly, it could be a matter of is the glass half full or half empty, right? In the sense that you could be encouraged by the fact that the centrists are in the majority, right? But then you've still got an incredibly high kind of anarchist, low trust share, essentially. So it's just showing you sort of how deep these problems of like trust in institutions are kind of in Britain and in other countries. Okay, so I think that our model explains current politics well, right? And that gives you these four ideological types that seem to be aligned to movements that we're seeing in current politics. An important kind of conclusion or finding in our work is that this stuff has been around for a long time. So if we see these ideological types as potential roots of populism, they've been there for the 20 to 25 years that we're sort of looking at in the data, right? So this is telling you sort of what's going on in terms of shifts in the right anarchist share. So we essentially divide the sample into the non-US, essentially Western Europe, Canada, and US. And what you're seeing there is that the kind of right anarchist share is fairly steady in the non-US countries and rises in the last wave. So the last wave in our data is the late 2000s onwards, right? So you're getting this kind of sharp increase in right anarchism in the US, but it's not necessarily evident across other countries in the data. In terms of the left anarchist share, you're seeing some increase, right? So in the US, what you're seeing is an increase off of a low base, but by the end, it's only about between 15 and 20%. And the general sort of, if you kind of look into the working paper, what we're finding is that globally, or at least in terms of kind of Western Europe and North America, people are becoming more left-wing in the sense that the left anarchist and the liberal centrist types are growing, but there's no clear pattern across countries in terms of shifts in these anarchist shares, right? So you'll get an increase in the anarchist share in the US and maybe in the UK and a couple of other countries, but there's not necessarily some global pattern that you would think would kind of drive international populism, right? So that kind of leaves us with some questions in terms of why has populism emerged so strongly now, right? So one kind of reason would be that the post-2008 crisis left us with stagnant income growth and ongoing inequality, right? And austerity made this work, and my colleague at Warwick, Timo Fetz, has got some great work looking at kind of austerity and patterns of voting for Brexit as an example of this. The hypothesis that I'm exploring at the moment, or we're exploring in CADE research, is that kind of technology is playing a really important role, right? And in particular that social media and related technologies have facilitated what I think of as political entrepreneurship, right? You can think of this as the kind of barriers to entry have fallen, right? So previously, people like Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage would have been kind of frustrated in a kind of lack of resources to coordinate and communicate, right? And with social media and general communication technologies, they've now got a way both to kind of transmit messages and then kind of organize political groups, right? And a good example of this was the emergence of the incredibly fast emergence of the Brexit Party from sort of components cannibalized from the existing UKIP infrastructure, right? And let's say, for example, the rise of the Momentum movement in the Labour Party over a few months in, was it 2015? Yeah. So I think of that as the barriers to entry have fallen, right? And similarly in the media, what we're seeing is that kind of there's been these sort of massive shifts in the structure of the media, and particularly the rise of what you would think of as alternative media, particularly on platforms like YouTube, which are kind of have this relationship with this political entrepreneurship and this kind of these changing political movements, right? So basically, sort of my argument there was is that sort of technology is playing this role. It's lowering barriers to entry, right? And therefore, you can think of what's going on at the moment as this increase in competition in terms of existing centrist politics, right? And my argument here would be that one way of seeing this is that centrist politics just isn't very good yet at competing in this new political environment, right? In the past, it depended too heavily on a concentrated media environment, right, which sort of was a barrier to competition, and a lack of alternatives facing voters, right? So a lack of political parties with the resources to put their point forward, right, and compete in party political competition. And so given this, right, I see two scenarios, right, for kind of politics going forward. One would be a kind of, I think of it as populism sputters, right? So you would get, the example here would be, you get populist leaders presiding over some kind of economic or political crisis. So let's say, if you had a difficult, hard Brexit, right? A difficult no-deal Brexit, right? And there would be some responsibility apportioned to populist leaders on that basis, right? And you would get, this cycle of things would swing back a bit, but perhaps only temporarily, right? So I see that as one realistic scenario. Another approach would be an approach of sort of rebuilding institutions, right? So this would be taking account of this increased competition, right? And existing critiques of centrist politics, right? And so the agenda here, I think it's sort of evident in sort of research that's out there in terms of credibly reforming politics. So here you can see a role for example, the role of political money in the US is well established, right? And people like Elizabeth Warren have got specific kind of programs, anti-corruption programs to deal with political money. We're starting to see the emergence of higher levels of political money in the UK under the Johnson government, and things happening in that respect. I think one interesting aspect of this increased competition in politics is it seems that political participation in politics may be broadening, right? So it's broadening outside of the traditional political elites, right? And I think that's where, so at CAGE, at our research centre at Warwick, we're beginning to collect data on the sort of more systematic data on the background of politicians and the backgrounds of candidates across all of these different political parties, right? But Other aspects of this kind of approach of rebuilding institutions would be a crackdown on tax evasion, right? So there's obviously proposals out there for quite dramatic progressive taxation policies, right? So progressive taxation of income and wealth taxes. I think in terms of those are things for discussion which have got quite good, deep sort of empirical research behind them, right? But they're still subject to debate. But I also think there's a general kind of role for just simple, decisive policies on cracking down on basic tax evasion issues. My colleague at Warwick, Arun Advani, has got some great work on this in relation to the UK. Other moves to kind of rebuild institutions would be sort of making the media more rigorous in some way. So here I think this is quite relevant for the UK in terms of the role of the BBC, right? So there's kind of an opening here to think about what the role of the BBC should be in terms of news. So there's currently an argument about the representation of balance in kind of BBC news coverage, but I think the bigger issue here is sort of how public broadcasting deals with and provides depth of coverage in this different media environment, right? So I see kind of, the BBC's challenge is a challenge of balance in an environment of increased media competition and incentives for essentially clickbait style media, right? And there, some work we're doing there is trying to kind of scrape down and systematize coverage on the BBC website and different aspects of the BBC just to try and see some kind of pattern in terms of what's going on in news coverage. But here I think there's room for a discussion about the role of sort of public broadcasting in terms of in-depth coverage of public issues. Also in terms of rebuilding institutions, another area of interest here would be thinking about the role of social media in politics, right? So I think social media, so Carlo's work is great in terms of looking at how he's got this great work on the AfD in Germany and where he's sort of examined how the AfD is using its sort of Facebook site as a kind of key locus of mobilization for the party. I think there's aspects of how social media is being used for popular mobilization, and then I think there's an increasing issue of like what social media is doing to our elites, right? So this relates to the crack, I'm about 6 minutes over, but I'm about to go. The crack I made earlier about our political elites being on social media like all the time, right? And subject to quite distorting kind of behavioral norms on social media, right? I say this as someone who's like a weird person who is very remote to social media. I just kind of see it as like an alien on Mars through a telescope. So that's kind of where, my kind of points of discussion. The final word on this, it's going to be dark, I'm sorry, Ian. Right, so what the data seems to, the basic conclusion here is the data seems to tell us that the roots of populist politics have been there for a really long time, right? In terms of these anarchist shares have been high for a long time. You're going to see some stuff is going to shift that around. So austerity is going to shift that up a bit. There's papers looking at the diffusion of technology showing it shifts up a bit. But I think the fundamental conclusion here is that it's been high for a long time, and you can think of it as latent. Technology arguably has played a big role in this, right? And you can see this as I see this as it might taper somewhat, right? There might be a pendulum swing back, but fundamentally I think what's happened is a rise in competition and political competition, right? And so that opens up this idea that what happened in 2016 was a 1979 moment, right? So a Thatcher-Reagan type moment, where you've got a shift in the nature, just like you've got a 1945 moment, a 79 moment. The prospect here is of a 2016 moment, right? So in that sense, I think an agenda here for politics is to kind of recognize that environment and start to think about these approaches focused on the rebuilding of institutions and the rebuilding of confidence and trust in institutions. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for giving me the extra time.
Thank you very much, Mirko. That's really as scary as it is fascinating. Let's open it up to questions. If I could kick off, I was quite interested in the right, the conservative. what's the terminology used?
Centrist?
Conservative centrist and the right anarchist bloc, because there you have this kind of the majorities on the right anarchist side, which makes me wonder what's your kind of what do you think the story is there about why the right anarchist bloc wasn't more able? This has been going for years, as you say. Why is the centre of gravity is on the right anarchists, unlike on the left here, this liberal centrist? So why has the right anarchist bloc not been able to capture the right-wing parties of more countries earlier on?
Earlier on.
I'm wondering what the dynamics are there.
The cheap answer would be like some kind of a elite control model, right? So like social elite control that it just sounds like newspaper columnist sort of theory.
Yeah.
That it's
sort of median voter story.
You'd have one argument would be there's a strategic incentive towards the median voter. Right, so that's something to be looked at in research. It's starting to look at. So it's either like a median voter thing that the party, the Conservative parties have an incentive to sort of try and capture the median voter, or it could be an elite control model where there's a particular group of people who control our political parties who are more on the Conservative centrist side. Right?
And I suppose sort of coming off the back of that, your data here only goes up to pretty much the financial crisis.
Yes, that's right.
So is there, I mean obviously your story doesn't rest on things having got worse or become more.
Yeah.
But do you think, is there other data that would make you think that we have got more polarised as well as the extremes having captured the parties? Or
So the reason it doesn't go past like about 2010 is because the questions aren't quite consistent past 2010, right? So what you get if you look past 2010 based on a similar set of questions is like roughly equal shares, right? In recent work, recent work by Guriev, Melnikov, and Zhurskaya, from PSC and Silence Post. So they're looking at international data from the Gallup World Survey and trust in government. So they establish a correlation between the diffusion of technology and falls in trust, right? So I'd say that, when you kind of rinse out the data on the 2010s, you'll probably see increases or decreases in trust or increases in distrust, right? But my point would be that this stuff is still it's coming off of a high base, right? In terms of, the minimal defensible empirical information here is that the levels are high, right? So, because, we've looked at lots of different indicators of trust. Over time, questions about trust tend to be very noisy on a year-to-year basis, right? So if you look at Gallup trust data for the US, it's sort of, you can see it swings about a bit depending on what's happening in temporary US politics. So trust falls a lot in the first Bush administration, right? It goes up a bit in the Obama administration. It's noisy from year to year, right? So that's why we don't necessarily stress that there's some clear explanation based on a delta, a change in these kind of ideological shares underlying trust.
Can I just piggyback on that question, because it seems to me that I'm going to try to put my political scientist hat on, even though I'm not a political scientist. A sort of finding in political science from Daniel Ziblatt and Sivovitsky's book was that in the 30s you did have these kind of populist attitudes that were underlying, like 30% of the population at the time is going to have populist sort of what you term kind of right anarchist attitudes here. But it's the supply side of politics that constrain whether those attitudes will find voice in the political system, right? So it's only when, on the supply side, the party politics collapse and centrist conservative parties fragment, that those attitudes are allowed to express themselves and make an impact in that behavior. So that's a different argument in terms of the story of what's doing the work. It's not the media, and it's not that's allowing the expression of the right question. It's the supply side. So I'm just wondering.
So you can think of the supply side in terms of fundamentally it's about the entry of political parties.
Right.
the ability of political parties to mobilize, right? Political parties can mobilize based on, their own communication, direct communication with voters, and then there's going to be a big component of communication through the media, right? So, and I would argue that technology has affected both of those things, right? That, you've got 5-Star organised off of a blog, it's built off of a blog. You've got, Salvini he's now got, like, Italian friend of mine was showing me Salvini's Instagram account, right? So that's like that's a capacity for direct political organisation that just didn't exist before about 2010, right? And then in terms of the media, you've got an increase in what I think of as alternative media, right? To mainstream media, right? And we're seeing this, the data is you've got in this data this low trust in the media, right? And that kind of fits with this current of the MSM, like distrust in the mainstream media, right? So I definitely think the supply side idea is a good way of summarising what's going on. Yeah. Cool.
I want to ask something about the left-right sort of graph
Sure.
details. So your argument is that people are not becoming more left-wing extremists, right-wing extremists. They're sort of losing trust in the government, and then there's
exactly.
this distinct anarchist type that's different from like hardcore extreme right-wing or hardcore extreme left-wing. But the thing is, because of social media, which is a point you touched on at the end of like future research, a lot of the news that we receive is sort of self-centered. So we keep seeing more news and more opinions that are similar to the things that we believe, which is something that didn't happen pre-social media. So actually, because this is a self-positioning scale, I am maybe more extremely left-wing, but because all the voices I keep hearing are as extremely left-wing as me, if you ask me to put myself on a scale, I will put myself on the centrist or relatively more in the center.
Oh, okay, I get it. Okay, your relative comparisons. Yeah, so
I'm not an anarchist, I'm just a
sure.
self-delusional, extremely right-wing person. Because you had another graph that had this scale and then controlling for the anarchist type.
Yeah.
And I'm saying because this is self-reported and the way we receive the news has changed and it's more extreme right-wing people listening.
Yeah. Oh, okay, so it's essentially like you position yourself based on some relative benchmark of what you see around you. You're saying that around you you're seeing you're exposed to more extreme media, so you position yourself to the right of Ben Shapiro. To the left of Ben Shapiro, the left of Ben Shapiro, and the right of Ash Sakar. Okay.
And the JMU.
I see enough social media. I know these people.
That's pretty good.
Exactly.
Yeah. I would say I think the big question on so to me the empirical question on social media is I think it's so it would be an argument that kind of Matt Kenskow and Jesse Shapiro make about the media and the internet is that kind of a lot of kind of right-wing populist voters, so Trump voters, they're not on social media, they're watching cable TV, right, because they're older people, right, who are kind of use the internet, the less traditional internet users. So I think it's an empirical question out there, like how important these filter bubbles are for personal positioning across the population. I can definitely see that mechanism, but I've been trying to get data on just how many people use social media on a regular basis. It just seems to be a selected group, and that's why I emphasize that our elites, I meet journalists, they're always on bloody social media and they're always thinking about this stuff. But there was a question there.
Yeah, I don't know if my question is for you or for us, but I'd like to get your view on it. So what you're saying is this latent anarchy tendency has sat there for a long time, but what we're seeing now is the rise of populism as those voters are able to sort of find a political home for those.
Coordinate.
But what sits in and why you call it anarchist is because it's anti-establishment. But as you see those parties capture the establishment, then how much does the anarchist view hold out, and how much can you remain anti-establishment when you voted in people to the establishment? And so I guess my question is, have you looked, when you disaggregate the data across different countries, places where you see populists coming in earlier on, do those types still hold, and do they remain as strong when if you see what I mean, that the anarchist vote is now aligned with the establishment?
I mean, that's that's still in progress in the sense that this kind of jump in populist voting is a recent jump. So we just haven't got enough examples. I mean, what's probably the most complete example of a populist government would be Syriza, maybe? And I don't know what's... Okay, would it?
No.
No? Oh, like a populist left government?
A populist left government.
Yeah. Okay, we can... So I think that development is... Yeah, so that's in progress, right? So I think once they... become, people, no one will ever say that they're the establishment, right?
I guess Trump's going to run anti-establishment messaging.
Yeah.
So
and like a reason that for anarchist is that it's also meant to kind of convey the idea that trust in institutions has fallen for kind of legitimate, compelling reasons, right? That sort of our political institutions. There's been dysfunction in our political institutions, right? And there's the key signal example of this, of where people think that there was a big fall in trust in the UK, was the expenses scandal, right? And so I think there's kind of work to be done there in terms of that seems to probably be the turning point, right? And austerity, right? So austerity is this symbol of people on welfare benefits have to kind of pay for fiscal consolidation. Other parts of society don't necessarily have to pay to the same proportional extent, right? So, you guys will know all about critiques of established institutions and neoliberalism and so on. So the anarchist point is meant to convey that this low trust is there for legitimate institutional reasons. Other quick, oof. Okay.
I was just wondering, so obviously the WVS has been used a lot for this kind of latent class analysis, like Inglehart with the Norris and stuff.
Yeah.
How does your work fit in theoretically and empirically with those who talk about what post-materialism axis or kind of an authoritarian liberalism axis, using kind of theoretically divide like latent class analysis and stuff as opposed to machine learning?
Sure.
What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I would say that, so we do some work, if you look, in the working paper, we're about to release the second version. So we run sort of alternative methods based on factor analysis and principal components analysis, right? So what we think we get out of this is this mixed membership structure, right? Where we've got the weights on the ideologies, on the probability of expression of those positions, and then we've got the topic shares, right? So we think that this is a sort of richer structure, right? I can't remember the full details of our work. I definitely, because he was behind building the WVS. Right? Post-materialism, I'd say we don't have, if you're thinking there about the rise of like feminist and environmental politics.
Well, even like the homosexual, all the indicators you use in your anarchists could be used as a post-materialism.
Right, okay, so there what's happening, what I haven't conveyed in this in this presentation is that, let's say you look at the conservative centrist ideology, right? So you've got those top 10 positions in the conservative centrist ideology. If you split that up across waves over time, right, what you see is that within the conservative centrist ideology, people become more liberal on issues like homosexuality, right, and abortion and so on, right? So what's happening is essentially you've got the evolution from John Major to David Cameron, let's say conservative 80s British conservative, 80s conservative politician to David Cameron, someone who's liberal on social issues, right? So my point there is that our model captures this growing social liberalism across all ideological groups, right? So you're seeing that, so it captures stuff like acceptance of gay marriage, right? And that's on a within ideology basis, right? So you've got what you would think of as people are moving left on the extensive margin, so there's, in most countries, there's bigger shares of the liberal centrist and left anarchist types. And then on what you would think of as the intensive margin of within ideologies, people who are nominally conservatives are less conservative on these issues over time. So that's where I think we capture post-materialism. Yeah, okay. I don't know who, yeah.
I was kind of interested in your comparison to 2016 to 1979.
Yeah.
And going back to your 4 types, we have the top list of kind of the characteristics. It made me think of Margaret Thatcher as a right anarchist.
Yeah.
In the way in which she attacked the kind of the institutions that existed, the distrust in the institutions that existed, labor unions, protected markets in the city with the Big Bang, etc.
Yeah.
And she kind of closed herself off to challenge from other parties or internally because she did the institutional reform bit.
Yep,
isn't that, I guess, kind of speaks to where we, maybe the centrists need to rethink our kind of position on institutions in particular, in institutional reform now, because that didn't work. It just made me think of her as an anarchist.
Well, yeah, so that's interesting. So you stare at this data and you look at the right anarchist type, you can definitely say, you can look at it and say authoritarian populist, right? So I think a term that you guys might know better than me. It's Stuart Hall, the sociologist Stuart Hall invented that term, I think, right? Luckily, I'm not going to look on social media to see people like piss on me for getting it wrong, right? But your point, okay, so I'd say you definitely see that kind of that authoritarian populist thing in the right anarchist, so you can label it that way. But what your point is what that about in terms of the implications of
which is that Thatcher was able to be successful by addressing the right anarchists' demands for institutional reform. And isn't the lesson for kind of left centrists today is to find a way to address the demands for institutional reform?
That's right, okay. So there the example would be, I would say, I was looking at Warren's platform the other day. The way I see Elizabeth Warren's platform would be it's essentially evidence-based populism, right? So she's got, I invented that, it's invented here. Right. I decided to give that out now. I'm really good at these kind of slogans. So yeah, I think that's, so that's evidence. And that's perhaps like, we'll see how it rolls out. But that seems to be a successful model for amongst the Democrats in the US at the moment. Like I'm a bit surprised by her success, right? But it seems, so some kind of evidence, as you say, like Thatcher addressed this kind of right anarchist stuff within particular types of institutional reforms, or perhaps she's sort of right anarchist and then.
But she still appealed to the right conservative on armed forces and a whole bunch of other kind of characteristics.
Yeah. So
it's a model for the left.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about why at the moment we have 2 parties at the extremes? I mean, looking at your figure 6, it still seems most of the votes are in the centre, and so median voter theory would imply that it's unusual for both main parties to lose their minds at the same time. One would move to the centre to harvest.
That's right. So this is a big thing. So
what's going on there?
I've got a couple of waves of the British Electoral Survey on my computer that I'm trying to line up. So there, I think we've got to think about whether the median voter. Let me shut this down. Sorry. No. Okay, so it could be that. Because it's a big challenge to kind of recent political scientists, I think, in terms of like why we've moved away from this median voter model, right? So it could be that underlying composition has shifted, right? So there, one hypothesis I want to look at is the effect of cohort structure, right? So what we see at the moment is this split by age in voting patterns, right? So where the Conservatives, there's this incredible gradient in age in terms of Labour versus Conservative voting, right? And so I'd be interested in knowing in terms of what this looked like 30 years ago. So it could be that we've just had a growth in left wing. The median has shifted, right? We've had a growth in left wing cohorts, right? Which would suggest that, and that would explain why these progressive populist movements seem to have a durable support, right? So there could be that there's just kind of demographic shifts that the median has shifted, right? The other hypothesis would be that a median voter model based on a left-right line was the wrong kind of model, right? That it was always a multi-dimensional structure, so a left-right line, and then it's something to do with some trust in institutions, the anarchist dimension, right? And then what was happening is that we thought we were competing on a median voter left-right line, but the underlying structure was multi-dimensional, left-right, and low trust and high trust, right? And it was just these institutional structures in the media, the barriers to entry in politics, that was stopping politics play out on this multi-dimensional model, right? So that's the two hypotheses I'd have in my head. So that's, if I get the time and the people to look at the data, that's what I think. Okay. Oh no, you've asked the question.
Probably thinking one more and then we should wrap up, I guess. You've got time for who's going to do a final question? No one?
Yeah, go. Who?
Okay, well I'll ask one.
All right.
So I guess my question, in terms of this kind of what's the cause of the breakout, you've got the social media kind of story, you've got the tech generally, you've got the financial crisis, flatline growth story. And I guess one sort of really basic stat that always makes me think about this is the age gradient on the Brexit vote.
Yeah.
So I guess you would say your anarchists are overwhelmingly pro-Brexit supporters in that referendum.
Yeah.
And so it should map pretty well. But it was overwhelmingly older voters who, I guess, are less likely to be on social media than
exactly. Yeah.
younger. So have you got? That's obviously just very broad numbers.
Yeah.
But if you got any, does that make you doubt the role of social media in all of this, or is that not?
But it'll have different roles and different bits of politics, right? So I bet you, like, social media has been fundamental to kind of Jeremy Corbyn's sort of organisation success within the Labour Party and on the left, right? So that they're definitely using social media as this major engine of both like coordination of the movement and then communicating stuff on Facebook, right? I would say on the right, they're relying on tabloid media and the BBC's incessant tendency to give Nigel Farage a forum wherever he requires it. So you can still have technology playing a role, in certain parts of politics, but not in others, right? So, but I tend to think it's playing this coordination role in terms of like just organising political movements, right? And even there, to give it to him, the Brexit Party did organise very strongly out of existing UKIP Facebook groups, right? So it's probably playing this coordination role, and there's a role in terms of elites, right? So that elites are consuming political news and debate on social media, and that's sort of driving overall politics. The jury's out on just what we don't have, what we need in terms of the empirics is information on people's kind of news consumption diaries and how that's changed over time, right? And to what extent they're getting stuff off of Facebook versus getting stuff off of newspapers and the BBC, right? So that's where I think we need some data, right? And my worry there is that we've lost the opportunity to collect that data over the last 10 years. Right? That stuff has just disappeared into the massive pool of data that we've got out there.
Right.
Well, he wanted to ask me, but
No, but just saying Ofcom, there's quite a lot of data on news consumption over the last decade, so it's quite extensive.
Okay. All right, I'll take it away.
So we're a little bit past 2
Sorry.
o'clock, so we probably better wrap up and get back to our social media bubbles.
Okay.
But thank you very much, Mirko, for a fascinating chat, and we'll be very interested to see where your work goes next.
Okay.
And hopefully stay in touch with it. Thank you very much.